Okay, Paul, so on the 12th of September you asked the Prime Minister's questions about the renewable energy deal the government's proposing at the moment. Do you want to just quickly recap what that question was for us?
Well, yes, I mean, I, like all MPs, enter my name for the weekly raffle to get drawn for Prime Minister's questions.
Yeah.
And, 2 or 3 times a year you do get drawn. And so I want to choose a topic which matters to me and I think matters to the country and the constituency I represent. And I wanted to go on fracking, but not simply on fracking, but linking it into the wider challenge that we face in tackling climate change and reducing carbon emissions, and to make the point to the government that they shouldn't be investing in and making it easy for others to invest in fracking as a carbon emitting technology, when at the same time they've been pulling back on their support for renewables, which have to be the future of energy production.
Okay, that's really great, 'cause it falls into line with the energy policy that's been being outlined by the Labour Party in the last conference we just had. I just thought we'd just set the ball rolling in terms of this interview. When I say climate change to you, how does that make you? What's your initial reaction to that?
That it's a hugely important issue and one that gets a lot of press, but there's not enough real public discourse on. So, for example, in my annual community consultation this year, I organised, as indeed last year, a specific session on climate change, because if I didn't, not enough people are raising the issue. But we had a brilliant event with Sheffield Climate Alliance and a really good discussion.
In fact, that sounds like a really good thing to have a quick conversation about. It's good to hear what the general public are saying about these things. So what issues do people raise in your session?
Well, people were worried about the pace at which government was addressing the challenge of climate change, whether with President Trump as the President of the United States, Paris was going to hold together, what practical things we could do locally, and so we came at the issue from every point of view.
Okay, so that raises sort of two things as to what we're going to do next, and maybe what we're going to do next locally as well. So just starting on, we've already mentioned Labour's recent party conference which has been through. So how would you set out Labour's policy goals to achieve climate targets and things like that?
Well, I mean, we've made very strong commitments to reduce carbon emissions above and beyond those previously made, and specifically in relation to energy production. I think it's so important in these issues that we don't just set abstract numbers, but that we develop a policy initiative that makes sense to people out there, because part of the reason I think constituents don't contact me about climate change is they see it as a sort of other issue, a future issue, something that doesn't affect them. So I think that we need to develop sort of win-win policies, which I've been going on about ever since I first stood for election in 2010, but which were very much framed in our recent party conference.
Just give an example of one of those?
Well, I mean, on retrofitting insulation to homes across the country.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, for me, a win-win-win, because it cuts carbon emission.
Yeah.
It reduces family energy costs, and it creates green jobs. Now, that's the sort of rounded policy on climate change which I think will win public appeal.
One thing that I've always found very perplexing when I've looked at this policy area is about how, even when you're essentially giving people the opportunity to upgrade their homes for free, and it will net them savings in the long run, people still seem remarkably resistant to accepting this technology. I really like the idea of trying to bring people into engaging with climate change and trying to make it as much about them as it is about the government and mutual action. How do you think we can address that problem?
Well, it is, people are always reluctant to take free £5 notes from the person that stands on the corner of the street offering them, because there's some suspicion going on there. But I also remember back in the 1980s, there were initiatives focused very much on energy costs about roof insulation. And actually lots of people took up the grants that were available for roof insulation. I think you've got to develop a very strong public narrative about how it's in your immediate interests. And by the way, it's also creating a sustainable planet for the future. So I think it's doable.
Which I suppose brings us back to what you were saying about making sure that it's more than just about numbers, the way you talk to people about it, making sure you communicate correctly and make sure that people pick up the ideas and run with them to some extent. So that's really good. So we want to talk about that. We have spoken about that a bit more about. Could you tell us a bit more about renewable energy and the way you see that?
Yeah.
Whether locally or nationally, wherever you want to start.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it comes back to my fracking question, really. I mean, the government have dismantled many of the incentives that Labour put in place to encourage the renewable sector. So the feed-in tariffs for solar, they've discouraged onshore wind. I mean, there's obviously been significant offshore developments, and I welcome that. But it's frustrating that at a time that they've made it easier for communities to object for the relatively benign presence of a wind farm, they've made it much harder for communities to object, and indeed they've made it easier for communities to be overruled when it comes to the much more intrusive initiative of fracking within local areas. And I think they've got their priorities wrong. We should be investing in new technologies, encouraging new technologies, and not still grasping to investing in old technologies and old carbon-emitting technologies.
So while we're talking about new technologies, a lot of the discussion around renewable energy sources such as solar and wind is they're not called non-dispatchable technologies, in the sense of you can't just put them onto grid whenever you like. And possibly with the advent of things like electrical vehicles, which as you mentioned in your question are an important part of the future, there could be a lot more local demand on grids, and the ability to adjust the capacity of networks becomes very important. And I think it's a problem across policy at the moment, that it doesn't really seem to be getting addressed. There's a lot of concern in the industry about it. The engineering industry, they're worried about how they're going to address this problem. I was wondering whether it's something you've thought about.
I mean, clearly, I think that this is something for the experts. As a politician, I think we set the policy direction, and I think that's one of the problems with the current government, that policy direction gets minds working. So when there was confidence in the support for solar, when there was confidence in the support for onshore wind, then the private sector was ready to invest and develop and tackle the problems and move forward. I think we need to set the direction and say, no, renewables are the future. And I leave it to the very talented minds that the university is producing and those who work in the sector to overcome some of the difficulties.
I promise this will be the last question on this line. So one thing that I found very concerning when I looked into it is there's a lot of diesel and gas in the capacity generation. There is some battery. I think it's about 10% of capacity generation in the capacity market is battery powered. But with increasing pressure on batteries, it's a question as to whether it's ever really going to soak up that market, in which case we risk the capacity sector being dominated by fossil fuels. I wonder how you feel in response to that sort of situation.
Well, I think that there remains huge potential for that not to be the case. I think that there is probably transitionally a role for nuclear, and I know that's kind of controversial, but I have worries about nuclear in terms of waste and in terms of the subsidy that the sector gets. But if the overriding priority is to reduce carbon emissions, and I think it is the overriding priority, then I think that nuclear has probably got a role to play, which addresses some of your concerns. And so I'm a convert in the way that Georges Monbiot is, for example, and he's made that case more convincingly probably than I would. I think we need to look at the sort of nuclear, and I know that there are advocates of small nuclear reactors as opposed to the approach the government's taking at the moment. But the experts really need to advise on that. I know this is a time in which so many people in the Conservative government tell us we shouldn't believe experts. I still have a lot of confidence in it.
Well, that's great. It's great to hear. So I thought we'd just wrap up the interview with a slightly wider bearing question about how you feel the so-called battle to try and save our world in terms of climate change and things like that, and addressing it internationally. How you feel that's going? So obviously you're on the front line of fighting some of these battles in one political theatre, but what impression do you get about internationally?
And I worry about the impact of leaving the European Union on UK policy, because the EU has provided a framework within which there's been tough regulation in terms of air quality, but on wider environmental issues, as well as tough targets on carbon emissions. And policies to back that up. On the wider environmental issues, I'm deeply worried that the regulatory role that the European Commission was able to play to drive government policy in areas particularly like air quality will be missed, and as an opposition we've tried to press that issue and get the government to put in force a robust alternative regulator. Now, they've said they would, but the proposals they've come up with don't. At a wider level, I mean, I know that people are worried, and it came out of the discussions I had recently. I know that people are worried about Trump and Trump pulling out of Paris, but we should also recognise what an extraordinary success Paris was, and just as Trump may be making efforts to undermine it, so there are countries which were, for a period of time, big polluters, like China, who are now recognising for all sorts of other reasons that the future lies in a different direction, a more positive
direction. The industrial juggernaut is very slowly showing signs of turning, as it were.
So I think we've got to recognise that there are some positive signs, because you can become very discouraging if you don't. There are positive signs, but if I was marking the world's homework,
climate change homework,
then I'd say some progress needs to do better.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul.